He played his final concert on a Friday night. 15 days later, he was dead. And the wildest part? The doctors only found the cancer by accident because his speech had started slurring and a friend refused to let it go. Here's what almost nobody knew about him while he was alive. The man the world dismissed as a walking bottle of whiskey, a joke about cigarettes and speed and loud guitars, was actually one of the most disciplined, well-read, and quietly principled men rock music ever produced. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand why the people who really knew him say the rest of us got him completely wrong. Ian Fraser Kilmister was born on Christmas Eve 1945 in Stoke-on-Trent in the middle of industrial England. His father was a former Royal Air Force chaplain and he walked out on the family when Ian was just 3 months old. That one moment set the tone for everything that came after. A lifelong suspicion of authority, a lifelong refusal to let anyone else write the rules for him. When his mother remarried, the family moved to a farm in Wales. And there, young Ian became the only English kid in a school of roughly 700 Welsh-speaking children. Years later, with the dry humor that would define him, he'd say it wasn't exactly a happy time, but it was fascinating. From an anthropological point of view, that's the whole man in one line. Hard experiences, filed away, turned into a joke he controlled instead of one that controlled him. Then, at 16, everything shifted. He walked into a packed club in Liverpool and watched a scruffy young band called the Beatles play before most of the planet had heard their name. It rearranged something in his brain. He went home, bought their first record, and taught himself guitar note by note. But here's the twist. It wasn't the melodies that hooked him. It was the attitude. He fixated on John Lennon's edge, that refusal to be polite, that sense you could be sharp and dangerous at the same time. That combination became the blueprint for the man he'd eventually become. He drifted through forgettable Midlands bands, worked factory jobs, even spent time at a stable mucking out horses. No plan, no money, no safety net, just a stubborn certainty that an ordinary life was never going to be his. So, in 1967, like half the ambitious kids in Britain, he moved to London chasing music. What he landed there was a job most guitarists would have begged for, roadie for Jimi Hendrix. Through a flatmate connection with bassist Noel Redding, he found himself hauling amps and setting up gear, sometimes for 2 shows a night. He was always honest that he got the gig through proximity, not talent, but it gave him a front-row seat to genius, and a memory that stuck with him forever. He described Hendrix as almost old-fashioned off-stage, courteous, gentle, the total opposite of the chaos he created under the lights. Hold on to that image because Lemmy would spend the rest of his life living out the exact same contradiction. Savage on stage, gentleman off it. Soon he got his own shot at the spotlight, joining a space rock outfit called Hawkwind on bass and an instrument he'd barely touched before. He learned it live, in front of crowds, and turned his inexperience into a signature style, playing bass like a rhythm guitar, thick and distorted, unlike anything else out there. Then came the single Silver Machine, which he sang led on, and it shot to number 3 on the UK charts in 1972. He finally had a hit, and then it all fell apart in the most absurd way possible. In 1975, crossing the Canadian border on tour, he was arrested, charged with cocaine possession. Except what he was actually carrying was amphetamine, his real drug of choice. Because the police charged him with the wrong substance, the case collapsed and he walked free. But the damage was done. Hawkwind, worried about future border trouble, fired him right after the next show. He was furious. And out of that fury, he did something classic. He decided to build a band louder, meaner, and uglier than the one that had just rejected him. His first pick for a name was blunt and unprintable, and his manager told him flatly it would never get radio play. So Lemmy grabbed the title of the last song he'd written for Hawkwind, British slang for a speed freak. Size, first idea bides, Eger Motörhead. He slapped an umlaut over the O purely because he thought it looked menacing, later admitting he'd borrowed the idea from Blue Oyster Cult, who then borrowed it right back. He recruited guitarist Fast Eddie Clarke and drummer Phil Filthy Animal Taylor, and that trio became the lineup fans still consider sacred. Their entire philosophy fit in 4 words, louder than everything else. Stories spread of gigs so intense the plaster reportedly cracked off ceiling tiles. Whether every story was exactly true barely mattered. The reputation became the product. In 1980, they released the album that would follow Lemmy to his grave, Ace of Spades. The title track, with its galloping bass line and Lemmy's gravel-throated growl about gambling and living fearlessly, became the anthem that defined him. The following year, a live album shot straight to number 1 on the UK charts. The loudest, scruffiest band in the country suddenly sat at the top. Here's the strange part, though. Lemmy never treated that song as sacred. He got mildly annoyed when audiences acted like it was the only thing he'd ever written, when he'd penned hundreds of songs. And he was adamant about something else his whole career. He refused to call Motorhead a heavy metal band. He insisted over and over that they played rock and roll, the same rock and roll he'd first heard as a teenager in that Liverpool club. Now here's where the whole story cracks open. The public saw a brute, leather, cigarettes, a bottle in hand, a permanent scowl, but the people who actually toured with him saw something completely different. A journalist who spent days on the road with him came away stunned, saying Lemmy seemed about 20 IQ points too sharp for the role he'd built for himself. Lemmy told him plainly that his mind needed constant stimulation, that without a book nearby, he'd lose his mind. While the rest of the band went out raising hell after shows, he often stayed behind alone, reading. He was a genuine amateur historian, and interviewers expecting a grunting caveman kept getting blindsided by his grasp of politics, history, and old comedy writing. It wasn't two different people, he once explained. It's that you can't stay wild every single hour of every single day, or you'll burn out completely. But one part of his private world genuinely unsettled people, and it followed him even after death. He collected military memorabilia, war daggers, medals, uniforms, much of it German, much of it from World War II. To plenty of observers, that looked indefensible on its face. But he explained himself the same way for 40 years. He collected the objects, not the ideology. He'd point out, with that historian's eye, that throughout history the villains tended to have the most striking uniforms, and joked that if the British Army had ever designed something sharper than plain khaki, he'd have collected that instead. He said flatly he didn't have a racist bone in his body. His own guitarist later had to publicly shut down the rumors, insisting Lemmy was simply a historian with zero sympathy for Nazi ideology. His drummer put it even more bluntly. The man hated fascists, and he hated stupidity even more. Then there's the part of his life he almost never let anyone see. Despite the legend of 1,000 romances, Lemmy never married and lived most of his adult life essentially alone. As a young man, he'd loved a woman named Susan Bennett, the great love of his life, he called her, and she died young after using heroin. He dedicated his entire autobiography to her. It's the key that unlocks the whole man, someone who built a career on amphetamines and joked that speed never killed anyone he knew, while carrying a lifelong, bottomless hatred of heroin specifically. In 2005, he even testified before the Welsh Assembly on drug policy and told them her story directly. The loudest man in rock carried a silence at his core, and he protected it for nearly 50 years. By his late 60s, the body that had survived everything finally started sending the bill. Diabetes, high blood pressure, a defibrillator implanted in 2013 after a near-fatal close call on the operating table. He switched from whiskey to vodka on doctor's orders and cut his smoking drastically. Still, the shows got harder. Then, on stage in Texas in September 2015, he managed only 3 songs before stopping and telling the crowd he simply couldn't do it, and walking off. The man who'd built his entire identity on never backing down had just been forced to back down by his own body. He had a little over 3 months left. And in a strange, almost eerie sequence, the band that built its name on being indestructible started falling apart right alongside him. Drummer Phil Taylor died that November at 61. Lemmy was devastated. Barely 7 weeks later, he was gone too. Guitarist Fast Eddie Clarke held on until early 2018 before passing as well. Within a few short years, the entire classic lineup had vanished. His last show was in Berlin on December 11th, 2015. Nobody in that building knew it was the final one. Days later, friends threw him a 70th birthday party back home. Then his speech began slurring. A scan revealed tumors in his brain and neck. On December 26th, 2 days after that birthday, a doctor told him he had terminal cancer, with somewhere between 2 and 6 months left. He got 2 days. On December 28th, 2015, Lemmy died at home. The cause was listed as prostate cancer alongside heart failure. From his last show to his last breath, 15 days. From diagnosis to death, 2. And the friend who visited him near the end said that even hours before he died, he was lucid, gracious, and thanked her for bringing him an old book on military history. The historian, reading right to the finish line. His memorial in Los Angeles was streamed to hundreds of thousands of people watching at once. Musicians who idolized him called him a hero, a king, the reason their own bands existed. He was cremated, and his ashes were sealed into an urn shaped like the hat he always wore. Fans even pushed to have a newly discovered chemical element named after him. It didn't happen, but tens of thousands signed the petition anyway, which tells you everything about what he meant to people. In 2025, his hometown unveiled a statue of him, with a portion of his ashes set into the base. An English kid who never quite fit anywhere. immortalized in bronze in the town where it all started. A father who vanished. A village where he never fully belonged. A band that fired him. A love he lost far too young. A body that finally said no. And a man who spent 70 years refusing to let any of it define him. The strange thing about his story isn't how hard he lived. Plenty of musicians lived hard, and most are remembered for nothing else. The strange thing is how completely the world misjudged him while he was still around to correct it. We saw the leather and the bottle and decided that was the whole story. The whole time, underneath it, there was a self-taught historian who couldn't sleep without a book, a man who despised the very symbols he wore as costume, someone who carried a lost love for half a century and used that grief to argue for better policy, someone who was courteous to strangers and fiercely loyal to friends right up to his final hours. So next time that galloping bass line kicks in and that gravel voice starts singing about gambling and refusing to fold, listen past the noise. That's not just a song about luck. That's a man who was dealt a rough hand 3 months into life and spent 7 decades refusing to give it back. If this one stuck with you, drop a like and let me know in the comments. Did you already know the real story? Or did you, like most people, only ever meet the caricature? Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives, and I'll see you in the next one.